Last day of PaizoCon Online 2023, we had the Into the Darkness panel. This was with Luis Loza, James Jacobs, John Compton, Vanessa Hodgkins, and Eleanor Farron, and kind of went into a lot of High Helm and Sky King's Tomb and the Darklands specifically, different races, changes that are being made, and there is a lot to it. Some of the things are pretty surprising and pretty controversial in a way, but understandable once we kind of discuss what's going on. So, my name is Don. I'm trying to be the Sly Strategist, and let's go ahead and get into it. Lost Omens High Helm is coming out next month, and this is going to teach us more about dwarves and dwarven lore, some of the hierarchy of the gods that are in that pantheon, a bunch of different things. And one of the things that it's going to bring to us is the connection it has to the Darklands via a network of tunnels and some other ways of getting there. Once we get into High Helm, and we'll be getting there with Sky King's Tomb, the Darklands are immediately accessible through the depths. And I'll go ahead and show that map here of the 4 layers. This is from a different panel, but it's pretty pertinent here as well. Although you can go there immediately, you probably shouldn't go there from the start because there's a lot of things that are going to get you into trouble. So there is, in general, guards in High Helm that are there to stop people from going down to the Darklands and things from the Darklands from coming up. Now, in this panel, we also discussed the Dwarven Pantheon. It was known, especially through Pathfinder 1E and some other bits of lore here and there throughout different adventure paths. However, they're fully fleshed out in High Helm from old mentions, and there are 8, I'll say new-ish deities that are fully fleshed out in this particular Lost Omens tome. Aside from the big 2, we'll go ahead and cover the ones that they covered in the panel, which was Mogrim the Taskmaster. He was introduced kind of like at the tail end of Pathfinder 1st edition. We have Coles the Oathkeeper. He kind of spread because of the Whispering Tyrant. He is the god of duty, honor, and promises. Then we had kind of a big conversation about these next 2, Trude the Mighty and Bolka, the goddess of marriage and love. So they are brother and sister. Trude is the god of strength and might. Pretty much was unknown outside of High Helm initially, but he's beginning to spread to the various orc clans and elves, and he's a little bit confused on what he's supposed to do with these other races that historically wouldn't have been praying to him for guidance, but he goes ahead and answers their wishes as well. Now, Caden Kalen tangles with flings a lot, and he's known to hit on other gods quite a bit. He's hit on Desna, he's hit on Callista a few times, but the funny thing is he's also hit on Trude. Bolka, his sister, is super fine with Caden hitting on Trude and wants them to pursue any type of relationship that they could possibly have. John Compton came on here with an interesting little quote and said, "Who among the gods hasn't been Caden Kalen's side piece at one time or the other?" Let's get into Bolka. Bolka is the Dwarven goddess of marriage and love. She apparently kind of is into fan fiction about love and relationships between various other gods and mortals and creatures and just love affairs in the world. So much so that if one of her priests messes up a loving relationship, she will smite them hard. She's into love, even if Dwarven tradition gets in the way of whatever love that might be. She is fully on the side of love. She is friends with other gods of love. Shaylin was the one being mentioned here as the most prominent goddess of love. Then we have Angrad, the Forgefire, god of fire, war, and tradition. Granzo, which is the goddess of debt, pursuit, and vengeance. Folgrit, who is the mother of the pantheon and is also the goddess of children, hearths, and mothers. And Grundenar, the peacemaker, who is the god of friendship, alliances, family, and truth. Then we got into the Sky King's Tomb a bit. Now, we've already gone into the Sky King's Tomb in a few other panels, like Pathfinder Adventures, but they did go into it a little bit here. So just to restate, it is a 1st through 10th level adventure path in 3 parts. So unless you really try to change things up, it can be 100% underground, starting in High Helm and going deeper and deeper and darker into the Darklands further away from civilization. Its basic theme is during the dwarves' quest for sky, there was an upward migration. So, over this 10,000 years that have passed, a lot of history and a lot of things have happened. They have been written down, sometimes in the stone tablets and everything along those lines. However, things have become more legendary than historical. We'll find some interesting clues throughout the adventure path, taking you deeper and deeper into the Darklands, especially about a legendary figure, High King Targic. I'll go ahead and show that picture here, although that was from a different panel again, who through this adventure path, you'll discover his forgotten history. It is a very dwarf-heavy adventure path, but it is not for dwarves only. There are tons of little hooks and little ways for any player character of any race that you'd like to bring in. And then we'll get into some of the back matter of it, which is the creatures. You'll have to excuse me on some of these pronunciations, but I'm going to give it my best shot. So there are a lot of interesting new creatures, like a new Algothulu. There's also Ulatkini, fish people that live underground. We explore their culture when they aren't under the Algothulu. We'll go ahead and bring up a second picture. This second picture is one of the Ulatkini people who is a mind reaver. There's interesting new items. There are relics that you'll find that are kind of like dwarven artifacts. They are historically significant and relatively powerful. And one of the big things they mentioned is that these artifacts will grow with you. So if you get it at a lower level, it will continue to build power as you build power. There are new archetypes. Some of them are weird and disturbing, their words. There are stone-based archetypes that let you empower your character to become living stone or use stone in your fighting style. There is a whole article included in this particular book that is about the ecology of cave worms. In another panel, we heard about the glacial and crimson cave worms before. However, they showed us a picture of some baby cave worms, and each one of these cave worms, when they're born as babies, they're about the size of a small dog. It goes into cave worm mating habits, what they like to eat, why they do not attack certain things. And this was from another panel as well, but they did bring up that when a cave worm is born, that is when it is determined what kind of cave worm it is, as opposed to glacial and crimson and the regular rock-eating cave worms. Something happens at their birth that determines what type they will become. So they are all the same species, just different versions of that species. There is a back matter article in volume 3 called Return to the Darklands. It is a James Jacobs article. It's mired in lore and history. So basically, when they first started doing Pathfinder stuff, they knew they wanted a big underground region. And that was in an article way back called Into the Darkness. And it was basically a Monster of the Darklands book. Then they came up with the idea of a tiered underworld that they expanded on throughout the end of D&D 3.5 and into Pathfinder First Edition. And it was basically a lot of, I guess, semi-random dungeons that were connected to the Darklands in various parts of the world, Tianjia. I mean, just pretty much anywhere there was a way to get into the Darklands. So they wanted to do a Darkland books for some time because there's a lot of interesting things. But then the remaster happened and there was a bump in the road, which was a little bit hard, more so than any other part of Golarion, simply because the Darklands are entrenched in the OGL, creatures and lore. There is the SRD. There's a lot of D&D-ness to the Darklands, and they wouldn't be able to use these things under the new Orc license. So this article is going to talk about what that means, and it's in the back matter of Sky King's Tomb, updating it for Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and how they're going to kind of explain this change or this new information is basically the original writer of Into the Darklands, Korea Asmarini, was the first one to explore the Darklands, and they're gonna basically kind of couch it as she fiddled with the truth a bit and wanted to protect the surface people because what was down there was so scary. It's a fairly brief article. And in this article, it's revealed that the previous information was kind of more fiction than fact. This comes out of Pathfinder Volume 44. And this is an excuse in universe for the big changes. So it updates the Darklands to Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Has a bunch of hazards and dangers. They brought up a couple: ghost mold, lazurite ore. It has 3 layers. Narvak, which is about 2,000 feet underground. Sekamina, which is about 2,000 to 8,000 feet underground, which has huge underground caverns, and Org, which is about 8,000 and deeper, kind of lost worlds things, hollow worlds. It's basically inhabited by elemental creatures called vault keepers or vault builders, and they kind of do these terrariums that make certain areas habitable and not overwhelmed with heat. And they are also part of Rage of Elements. But the bulk of the article is about the denizens. So Cavernels have an ancestral name now. This article gives them an identity, Aum Delor. Smaller settlements is kind of where they live, but they did have bigger cities in the Darklands, and they are one of the good guys in the Darklands. Drow could not be salvaged because of all the baggage with the OGL, SRD, and D&D-ness. And we'll talk more about that later in this particular video because they kind of went back to it at the end. So they're going to leave them behind in favor of the Aum Dilar and this elaboration of the Cavern Elves. So they'll be taking a more extensive look at that in the future. So we'll get a little bit more information later. Another one was the Harengar, which is a reflavor of the Deep Gnomes. They're good guys as well. They're basically umbral gnomes that are there as well in the Darklands, and they are inspired by the old Deep Gnomes. So previously known as Duergar, the subterranean variant of dwarves, they're the dwarves who decided not to engage in the quest for Sky from High King Targic, and the picture they showed was one mounted priest of Druskar on a battle beetle. So to kind of explain this a little bit, Paizo has been looking at the slavery issue, especially with the Duergar, and they had to decide on how to move away from that with these guys. So Harengar society is now driven, and it's kind of funny, by a pyramid scheme mentality. So this is a multi-level marketing kind of thing. And what it deals in is it helps create a system of obligation and debt. So if they do you a favor, they use that debt as leverage for anything that you do going forward. It is literally calling it an upline and downline mentality. So they try to reduce their own upline or people they owe and increase the number of people who owe them the downline. It's a tit for tat kind of system of favors and commerce. And they will constantly try to actually set people up to increase their levels of obligation and decrease their own. So they are constantly maneuvering not to owe others and make others owe them. So to kind of highlight this once again, they are the dwarves who were left behind with nothing when the other dwarves went up in the quest for Sky. And since they had nothing, they turned to Droskar. They're driven by a huge resentment against other dwarves for leaving them behind. And they had a little quote here too, that they're basically driven by the power of butthurt, and they feel betrayed regardless of what the actual history is. Because of this, they kind of flavored them a little bit, so they have an innate occult magic, and they all have the cantrip sigil, every single one of them. Because of this system of debt and obligation and things like that, they're always marking things. Who made what and who owns what, because their society is so focused on tracking ownership. They also get 2 new second level powers. They have Blood Vendetta as a reaction spell, which is kind of like a you hurt me, I'll hurt you back type of spell, and a Paranoia spell, because the lack of trust in relationships and how it has permeated society because of the machinations that go on just to exist. And they actually, one of the things that was kind of a joke here was that Sigil is literally like an innate power that is a label maker. Then we talk about the main villains of the Darklands, which is the Serpent Folk. They have been in the lore for a long time, and these are the ones that are basically going to replace the Drow as the villains. So you can think of them, and so pertinent to me as someone who was around in the 80s, is that these Serpent Folk are kind of like the villains from V, if you remember that TV show way back in the 80s. They're called the Sekhmins. They live in the Middle District, which is Sekamina, and it's named after their ancestor. In the old days, they ruled the Darklands. There were wars between the people of Aslanton and them before Earthfall. There's a bunch of spooky underground things and still existing cities that used to be Drow cities that are now revised to be Serpent Folk cities and Sekhmin strongholds. Xerxes is their god, but apparently he got his head cut off, so he's been a little bit less organized since he got his head cut off. Their main role is to plan to come up from below and replace humanity. That is what they want to do. They want to come out of the Darklands and replace humanity as a whole. They're an organized, powerful group who is out to get everyone and preparing to invade the surface. They mentioned a few other cities, Farpathia, which is kind of like the Serpent Folk debauchery city, many small cities all throughout the Darklands along an underground lake, and Zemacane, which is formerly a big drow city in the middle of the Sekmen Empire. But there's a mystery in it because no one knows who built it, even the people who live there, and the Sekmen themselves are afraid of it. Now, one of the other things they brought up at the end is a Lost Omen Darklands kind of feels inevitable, but they need to find a good spot in the schedule in order to put it. We have things, if you remember, if you've been watching any of the panels from this whole week, they have things going all the way out into the middle of next year, or maybe not the middle, but maybe the end of the first quarter of next year. And they need to find a place to put this. How much Darklands they could really show off is questionable if they try to put it out too quickly. But someday they're going to have to deal with that growing avalanche. Now, here is the big thing about the Drow. They will not be doing much with Drow going forward. It's not going to be part of anything that they put out. It's too bound to the OGL, it's too bound to the SRD, and it's too bound to Dungeons and Dragons. It was brought up in this panel, and I also saw something in the Discord about it, but they won't be doing Drow at all, although they still exist. So if you have a character or NPC, you can continue to play it. They'll be updating other things and adding new things to the Darkland in order to kind of keep up with that. If you want to still use Drow at home, there's nothing stopping you. The existing rules will still be in place in like the Archives of Nethys and Bestiary 1, but they won't be focusing on it going forward. They'll be doing their own thing. Like I said, in this particular Lost Omens cycle, it's the Serpent Men that are doing it, that are taking their place. But as far as playing Drow or having Drow still exist in your campaigns, their thing was it's tricky and every group is going to have to decide for themselves, but they are still going to exist if you would like them and to use them in what you're currently doing. James talks about Shetson, which used to be a Drow, and then she comes back as an aquatic elf via a reincarnation event. And here's a little bit of something here that I thought was interesting, is there is an actual name for half-elves, and it's called Delif. I believe that's how it was pronounced. So basically, they're turning, this is the phrasing they use, basically they're turning the lights off in the room of where Drow would be in favor of other stuff. But you're welcome to turn those lights back on yourself. And very specifically, there will be no Drow ancestry or heritage. Cavernels can get you part of the way to Drow if you want to. From there, we'll move on to the questions and answers. So they had space for a few in here and a really good few answers. So the big question that was asked, or actually it's a small question, but it went into a lot in the answers, is did the remaster drive any innovation or forced invention? So they found that the reevaluation of lore spurred by the remaster did cause them to innovate in response, and they needed to apply the lessons they learned and create something new. Originally, they just tried to balance existing lore with new lore, but because of the remaster, they totally had the freedom to say, if we're changing things, then why don't we just make it better and reinvent it within the existing canon? So Monster Core will be leaning heavily on existing mythology and folklore and kind of taking it away from the OGL and the SRD. So there is an interesting little critter in Impossible Lands called the Kashish. The Kashish were created by Vault Keepers, and they have a word imprinted on them, literally kind of like a golem, but they aren't golems. I'm just saying that they actually have a word written on them. I didn't particularly say where that I heard, but it is a grammatical construction. So you could have a Kashish that has word written on them somewhere and another Kashish that has fire written on them. And once they come together, you get words that spew fire. So for this particular case, they don't like being near one another. Because of the changes with Drow and flesh warping, you will more likely see flesh warps come up out of the Darklands. Flesh warps are going to be tweaked going forward. We didn't get any specifics, but they did bring up a specific flesh warp called Inner Curse. Inner Curse was formerly an elf specifically, and they kept coming out of the Darklands. So the flesh warps are going to get some of their lore redone, but we do not know specifically how. And they have this underground city town called Umberweb under Varisia, and it's made up of Driders. In the past, drows treated Driders as lesser than themselves. It will probably now be a city of flesh warps instead of Driders, and these changes are allowing them to refocus to make it something that makes more sense geographically. That was the end of that question. Then one question came up on with technology, fireworks, and clockworks. How will gunslingers fit into the Darklands? They brought up specifically the Clicking Caves in Tangia. The dwarves created guns underground, so that would make sense and even be broadly appropriate for the creatures under there to also create them. There's a lot of technology that has been filtered to the Hrengar, and they have some technological prowess themselves, mainly engineers that re-engineer technology from other cultures. And then the last question was talking about the archetypes in High Helm. Once again, we actually heard about this one in another panel, but High Helm has a stalwart defender archetype that's all about being tough and tanky. Specifically, that gives you a stance that will give you temporary hit points and be harder to push around. And it will also help with fortitude saves. There are also some things that you can do that will allow you to stomp on the ground to make difficult terrain around you, and also activate further abilities to be tough. They didn't get any more specific than that, but this particular archetype can be taught in High Helm, not specifically to dwarfs. So that's always a good thing. Now, I hope you like this little summary of Into the Darkness panel. I kind of enjoyed making it. I necessarily, before PaizoCon, wasn't super hyped about High Helm. I like doors, but I thought it might be a little bit too focused. But with all the Darklands and some of the lore and the fact that other types of races, other classes, all the different clans, all the different things going on, there's a lot more to it than I thought there would be. So I'm very, very interested in the Darklands and the High Helm setting, and super interested in playing the Sky King's Tomb as well. But I do hope you like this little video and the summary. And if you did, feel free to like, subscribe, or hit that notification bell. But whatever you do, I hope you have a great day and happy adventuring. Thanks.